Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my Applied Geography Conference 2020 online presentation of A Fair Candlemas, the use of folklore to teach upper air meteorology and climatology. I'm Dennis Edgell from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. I'd like to give you a little bit of background for my presentation. This presentation is the second topic in my geographic educational series, Meteorology and Myth. The purpose of my ongoing project is to develop teaching modules which bridge the concepts of physical geography and atmospheric science with examples and stories from history, folklore, art, and culture. These teaching modules are delivered as special topic lectures and online discussion boards in my general education courses. One thing I've noticed, and it's a general education challenge, very often students majoring in the majors in the arts and humanities often struggle with coursework in the sciences, geography, the geosciences, the STEM fields. Conversely, students in the STEM fields and geoscience, very often they need to have a greater appreciation for culture, arts, and the humanities. Well, I teach an introductory general education meteorology course called Weather and Climate. Whenever February 2nd rolls around, a student will always ask if Groundhog Day predictions are true. I used to always answer, no, because meteorologists know a groundhog in its shadow can't predict the weather several weeks in advance. But I got to thinking about it though, and I started to hypothesize that there might be a good teaching opportunity within the folktale. Are there geographic factors which have allowed the folklore to survive and diffuse? If it doesn't make meteorological sense, could it make climatological sense? Well, the purpose here is, the point is not to have students prove if Groundhog Day predictions are true or not. That this story is meant to present complicated atmospheric concepts to a general audience in hopefully an understandable and relatable way. Another outcome for students is to develop an appreciation for history, folklore, and human environmental interactions. This is a copy of the handout that I used for my introductory geography students. It has a list of geographic terms and concepts. Many of these are in their textbooks. And there's also another part where I pose 3 questions to them. I want them to know what Candlemas is. I want them to be able to explain why Groundhog Day predictions can't be true meteorologically, but there may be something to it climatologically. And also, and this is also part of the story, is to defend and explain this apparent paradox that global warming has been contributing to record-setting cold temperatures. And I also have an upper air chart that I used as part of the handout too. The teaching strategy I had was to give this lecture to 2 introductory general education courses, my Principles of Geography course. The lecture itself was designed to be delivered in 40 to 45 minutes, and students then had about 25 minutes to complete their written answers. So between the 2 sections, there are 62 introductory students, and credit was given to them for participation and completion of the questions. Now, I consider this survey to be informal, mostly qualitative information. It's used mainly to assess my own teaching of these topics. And then I compared the feedback I received for A Fair Candlemas with other topics in my Meteorology and Myth series. At this point, what I'd like to do is give you the story of A Fair Candlemas. Now, unfortunately, the full lecture is more than 60 PowerPoint slides, and I won't bore you with all that many details. Instead, here's what I'm going to do. A good way to cut to the chase is to share with you the research poster that I made for the topic. Here I hit some of the major explanatory reasons that tell the story of a fair Candlemas. So let's take a look at some of the components of this in order to speed things along a little bit. We know it as Groundhog Day, but February 2nd is also important in other religions. Candlemas Day was an observation in Europe. It commemorated the purification of the Virgin Mary. It's observed as the feast of the presentation of Jesus at the temple. There's also a religious holiday in the Celtic pagan religion, Imbolc, which means in the belly, referred to ewe's milk, which was a part of the celebration of the coming spring. It wasn't spring yet, but they observed that spring was coming. And that also evolved to be the feast of Bridget, and later an Irish Catholic saint named Bridget. So it's this day, February 1st, February 2nd. It's one of the cross quarter days of the year. It's midway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. Well, the way it's supposed to work is that on February 2nd, if the groundhog sees his shadow, he gets scared and runs back in his hole, and there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter. Whereas if he comes out of his hole and doesn't see his shadow, then that means that there's going to be an early spring. All right. Well, now, although Groundhog Day is celebrated as an American folk cultural event, any climatological rule about February 2nd really should be derived from analysis of the long-term weather observations in Northern Europe. And actually, what with the legend itself, the groundhog legend actually diffused from Europe. It was a European badger that was the first predictor of an early spring or more weeks of winters. And there's a difference climatically between northwestern Europe and the northeastern United States. So I think that any rule that you'd make about a fair Groundhog Day would have to be based on the upper air pattern in Europe. Well, it may be folksy nonsense because Puxaltani's Phil does not have a very good track record on predicting an early spring or not, but uh, sunshine on Candlemas Day was not seen as a good thing in Europe of centuries ago. The farmers did not want to see a sunny Candlemas, a fair February. There are a lot of old sayings that go along with this. One of my favorite ones is a Welshman had rather see his wife on the funeral than see a fair February. So there's something bad about seeing a sunny Candlemas day. Because what a farmer would want to have is a slow, gradual warm up, not up and down temperatures of seeing sunshine on one day followed by cold spells, because that would be bad for the crops that are wintering over. So a fair Candlemas became one of the more feared weather omens. Now, the explanation for what would cause a fair Candlemas or not. Part of the explanation involves a number of slides that I have to show that show the importance of upper airflow, upper air ridges and troughs, the Rossby waves, jet streams. Zonal versus meridional is a very important part of the explanation. And also sudden stratospheric warming and the weakening of the polar vortex and cold air outbreaks is also part of the story. Let me cut to the chase here right now. The zonal versus meridional. When you have a basically west to east flow, that's called zonal. And when the upper air flow is very wavy with big undulations that's up and down the meridians, that's meridional. Well, here's how it would work. If, say, in a given winter in northwestern Europe, the overall pattern for much of the winter was zonal, then probably what you would have is seasonal temperatures, a slow, gradual warm up towards spring. And that slow, gradual warm up, not punctuated by a number of cold spells, you might be perceived as being an early spring. However, if the upper air flow was meridional, up and down the meridians, well, this would cause highly variable weather. It would work in two different ways. If the wave was bringing air that's been to the south straight up, that would mean warm and clear temperatures, and so that's a warm spell that would be unwanted. Conversely, if you had clear skies, that may be a cold air mass on the downward part of the meridional wave. So it'd be clear, it'd be sunny but cold. Well, either one of those would be indicative of a wavy upper air pattern, wavy Rossby waves. The shadow inducing conditions of clear skies would be unwanted. So if you have the situation of warm ups and then freezing, warm ups and freeze, that may be perceived as being a long winter. And climatology is a gain of averages. And in those years when the fair Candlemas observation was made and it was true, that would be reinforced. And then it would just be ignored if it didn't come true. Now, one of the big factors to also see here is uh, the northern Atlantic oscillation, the Arctic oscillation, and the North Atlantic oscillation. It is this temperature and pressure tendency in the North Atlantic and Arctic. When there's a big pressure difference between the Icelandic low and the Azores high, then you have a zonal flow coming into Europe. Now, the situation is when you don't have as much of a gradient, you get a greater upper air wavy flow. And so that's going to bring more variable weather, clear skies, and then freezing temperatures and so forth. So that's not what you would want for the growing of crops. Now, there's another part of this wavy flow that's important, and it does relate to global warming. Overall, if there's a temperature increase and there's a decline in the pressure gradient between the Icelandic low and the Azores high, then you're going to have that wavy pattern. With that wavy pattern, those waves sometimes break and put a little bit of air into the upper atmosphere. And when that bounces up and then bounces down, that causes a phenomenon known as sudden stratospheric warming. And what that does is that breaks apart the circulating polar vortex over the poles that spirals around. Well, when that polar vortex weakens, it splits and it causes cold air to break out. Well, the lessening temperature and pressure gradient is associated with rising temperatures. So oddly, the increase in global temperatures, global warming is causing more cold extremes by causing the weakening of the polar vortex and cold air outbreaks. All right, so that's the gist of the explanation that I give. Although I will say that the groundhog predictions of being true or not, that's not really the issue. Increasing climatic variability, that would be the issue. After telling that story with about 60 PowerPoint slides, did my students learn anything? Well, looking at the results from the two classes about explaining what Candlemas was and the cultural significance of it, most of them said that they can do that. They understood that pretty well, and a lot of them were interested in learning about Saint Bridget and what Imbolc was. A lot of them have never heard of that before, so it's an important part of uh, Irish history, Western Europe history as well. The part about explaining why Groundhog Day predictions can't be true meteorologically, a lot of them knew about that beforehand, and a lot of them were fairly confident that they would be able to explain that, and that they would say that, well, basically the meteorological part of it is that, well, it's a 50-50 coin flip then. So on the weather on one particular day can't predict the weather of the next 6 weeks. So that I think was fairly good, even though they did seem to understand somewhat the climatological context, that climatology is a game of averages, and over the long term there could be that association. And then the part about the global warming, that was probably the one that had the most confusion about that. And there is a lot of confusion out there still about climate change and global warming. I think at that point they were getting overwhelmed with the upper air figures and following along with that. Well, so the overall answer that I have from this is that generally students are very confident that they learned something and that they could answer the questions. Although some of the written answers, particularly about the climate change, was a little bit more variable, and that students thought that they knew about it, but then what they wrote down really didn't indicate that. And so this is just another piece of evidence, I think, that introductory general education students still have some work to do in understanding climate change and global warming, and I need to do a better job of explaining it. Other navel gazing, I suppose I can get out of this. Well, teaching upper air circulation is difficult for no prerequisites students, for general education students. And I also conclude that I think I need to improve my explanation to find a more simplistic way to explain what's going on in the upper atmosphere. I still am very encouraged that students were very interested in the cultural aspect of it and learning about what Candlemas was. So many of them had never even heard of it before, even though I would later overwhelm them with upper air meteorology. And I continue to be encouraged by the possibilities of using mythology combined with meteorology to teach special topics in general education courses. And in general, the comments were positive comments, I would say. A lot of them had not heard of some of these topics before, and it is true that they did become a little bit overwhelmed by some of it, but overall, I would have to say that it's fairly successful. I will continue with my meteorology and myth series. Perhaps next year, you'll hear about Krishna's monsoon swing or the ephemeral sprites, the hurricane, a Carib god of evil, Satan's winds, and the dead man walking, amongst others. This meteorology and myth program is meant to reflect geography's holistic view of seeing the the human and the physical together. And I like to find evocative stories and imagery that hopefully make these atmospheric concepts more engaging to students. And there's a lot of opportunity for our majors to take some of these topics and take the ball and run with it and produce publication, conference presentation, and so forth. All right, well, I think I'm going to have to sign off at this point. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.